Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a couple of newcomers into the temple. Part of the massive endeavor that is Flux Fantasy, which is soon to be making its encroachment into the wonderful world of TTRPGs. We have the head honcho of the affair in Chris Moujaes. I probably mispronounced that because
you got it closer than I thought. I was going to say he's going to
Moujaes.
You got it close. That was a good first try.
I've had to deal with a lot of Eastern European names over the last few months, so and those names are hard mode.
Mm-hmm.
And his community manager, Ella Powell. How are you two doing today?
Doing awesome.
You're so good, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Mildred, for having us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for coming on, and thank you for being open to doing this with me. I know that I remember that there was a little bit of stumbling at certain points because during one of the email exchanges I forgot to CC both of you because usually when I've been doing these things it's a one-on-one. I've rarely had to deal with two emails at once.
Oh, listen, it's totally fine. And if it wasn't for Ella, I wouldn't know my head from my tail. So, Ella's the one who keeps me going. So,
yeah, my title is community manager, but it's really Chris's manager is really what it is.
Don't even. I have like weird boomer moments from. that she's experienced, that she's and I'm not a boomer, and she's helped me out with. So
I've said on multiple occasions, you don't need to have blonde hair to have a blonde moment.
That's right, boy. And am I the prime example of that?
Mm-hmm. And sometimes part of my job is cleaning up the messes, so I completely relate. But
Ella and you'd be good friends.
Mm-hmm. But it's a bit of a tradition to open with the humble beginnings, and we'll get into the origin story of Flux Fantasy in time. But first, I have to adhere to the traditions of my temple. So I'd like you to walk me through your first introduction to the concept of role-playing games and what made it stick for you.
So I'll go, and then Ella, would love to hear yours too. I mean, for me, I think a lot growing up in the 80s and 90s, the first touch of RPGs obviously began with video games. I grew up in a small town, And getting into TTRPGs at the time was not as accessible as they are now. But I was, loved, Final Fantasy, games like that were available on, the original Nintendo, Super Nintendo, things like that. And that was my first foray into just RPGs in general. But then it was much later when I started learning about what the tabletops were like, that it took me a while to get into them because I had this. I was intimidated, because I had no one to kind of walk me through. All these numbers and these sounded so complicated, and I didn't want to look stupid. And it wasn't until later, many years later, when I became head of Funimation's original entertainment group, which I had founded to develop all their original anime and TV shows and movies and music and their music department that I ran for many years. That during that time, I had come into. We started talking with different companies. Some of them are. One of them was Dungeons and Dragons at the time. We talked to them about doing an anime, and getting into. You and I were talking before the interview about authenticity and really understanding details and really giving the things respect. And it was my first experience with witnessing a tabletop at the time. And what I walked away from it was, what really stuck with me was what an experience it was, that the welcoming experience that I had come in as someone who knew nothing about how they worked, and the storytelling and the excitement and the passion and just making new friends. It was something that I did not appreciate because I was afraid at the time of what that would encounter, what that would entail. And so going through that experience really stuck with me. Playing that game night, that first game night, and really understand. So that was my first experience playing a D&D game, way back then. I mean, what about you, Ella?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because I'm sure that there's lots of different examples that people have, but mine I feel like is a little bit different, and I'm gonna out myself a little bit. But I was a big theater kid, and that's what I did. And so for a lot of my life, like growing up, we played theater games, which was basically like RPGs, but without the dice, and we would make up these stories and we would keep them in our heads and, have rules and mechanics and chalk on the ground that, if you go within this limit, you'll get blown up because you're a robot and robots can't go into this area or whatever it was. But yeah, so I did that for a long time. And I loved, doing the acting portion of it. So then I got into board games, and board games were always boring because like you couldn't make up your own character, so you would modify board games to like, this is a pirate, but instead it's, it's going to be the captain, and you break apart games a little bit and you remake them in the way that you want. And then like much later in my life did I actually find D&D and go, oh, like somebody's already done this. Like I didn't have to put in all the work for it, and I could have just gone and bought the book, but instead, I always like to take things apart. Like there's like a new board game, like the Goonies board game is kind of like an RPG, although it's like more script based. But yeah, so that was mine. I know it's not necessarily conventional, but yeah.
I've been doing the interviews for about 5 years, so I know it may sound like like people's origins might not be the most conventional or unconventional, but as in my experience, every origin story is more unique than a lot of people think.
Yeah.
And hell, I know it'd be easy to assume that everybody gets their start through experiencing Dungeons and Dragons. That's not as universal as a lot of people think, especially in certain parts of the world, and even more so in say Japan, where D&D doesn't have that big of a footprint. It has a footprint, but it's significantly smaller.
Well, that's good to know. Then, Chris, we're not so alone, I guess.
Now, I've often there's a small whenever somebody ends up stepping into the world outside of the D&D bubble, often feel like I'm channeling Nick Fury at the end of Iron Man, saying, "You've stepped into a whole new universe."
Right. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I should cosplay him the next time I'm at a con instead of going into a convention with a metal trash bin with a tag on it that just says "Your waifu."
Mm. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That would be a change.
That was funny though.
I bet you got a lot of people taking pictures with you.
Yeah, the whole point was to troll the convention. I've done, not the last time I've done that. I've been at a FMA themed panel, not with any voice actors, but with a bunch of cosplayers, and I come in with a boombox playing Randy Newman's Short People.
Oh, leave Ed alone. Leave Ed alone.
I told you this before we went live. I hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are cremated equal. This means
fair. That's
everybody gets the roast.
That's fair. That's absolutely fair.
So, with that said, and hang on a mo. Oh, there we go. Sorry, the visual part was acting up, so I had to deal with that. So, with that said, this is where I want to steer a little bit into Flux Fantasy before I get into the RPG aspect of things, since this, as I understand it, and I am a little bit late to the party, this is a project that's something of a multimedia affair. The RPG is just one angle of it. So how did this particular concept come about?
So when I was at during my years at Funimation, I had been developing the idea of Flux Destiny for a while, and in the background, and I had been developing it. Actually, has its roots in a webcomic that I did in the early 2000s that was called Battlegate, and had actually done really well at the time. But it was very early. It was very nascent. It's nothing like what Flux Destiny became. But I had always loved and appreciated. This is, I'm going to go back to that pre-interview talk we had, where creators had put so much into the development of their universe. And like that saying goes, it's like, God knows when even a single bird in the world dies, right? It's the same thing with a creator of their universe. They know every angle and every corner and nook and cranny of their world. And so I had spent the next several years developing the idea for Flux Destiny, and I'll share what that is in a second. But it was a labor of intense love that I put into this to develop a universe that had its own unique magic system, that had its own themes, that the overworld itself would not only allow for the telling of a mainline series of books in there, but that could be a playground for people who were fans of the universe to create their own original characters, to tell their own stories, to provide them all that material that they could have a good time. And connecting back to when we were talking about our origin story, which I'm so glad you asked about, that was that I still remembered what a great time I had in that game night. And I said, I want to be able to provide that. And Flux Destiny was a result of that. And so, in short, Flux Destiny is a series where the power of karmistry, which is the name of our magic system, lets you defy reality. It lets you turn the impossible into the possible. So those who master karmistry are superstars called escape artists. And they earn this fame by expertly balancing the thrill of their powers with the risk of payback, which is the universe's dangerous reaction against those who are trying to disrupt how things work. And so escape artists use karmistry, which is they channel karma from the environment and from themselves to be able to mess with the programming of the universe, so to speak, in a nutshell. The universe doesn't like that. And so depending on the amount of karma you channel and how much karmistry you perform, the universe has its immune system, which is payback, and it's literal in this world. And so escape artists know how to perform karmistry and avoid payback in the process. So Flux Destiny takes place in Fortuna, which is a nation very much like the United States in the early 90s that has been radically transformed by karmistry. And here, everyday life, blends with the extraordinary, and it turns Fortuna into like this theme park-like world of incredible man-made realms that we call Flux Destinies that are made possible thanks to the talents of escape artists. So they can create these kind of pocket realms called Flux Destinies. And so the main story follows teenage best friends Hugo and Marco, who both show raw talent in karmistry, and they dream of becoming famous escape artists. Mm-hmm. And their dreams and their friendship are tested when an unexpected twist in events forces them on the run from these figures who are in pursuit of something called the Rabbit's Foot. And that was dismissed as kind of this cliche plot device on TV, but it's actually a real thing. And, alongside they have this, in our universe, robots are called clockbots. And alongside their clockbot, Lucky, they're propelled into this journey of, growth and revelation that challenging these sinister forces that are manipulating events in Fortuna. So, that's in a nutshell what Flux Destiny is, the story. And so when you talked about the multimedia aspect of it, it started way back when as a webcomic that evolved into the first Flux Destiny pilot book, which was called Fortuna's Rings, Flux Destiny Fortuna's Rings, that if for any of your anime fans out there, was performed and narrated by Todd Haberkorn, who is pretty prolific anime voice actor and a dear friend of mine, and he performed this. He did an amazing job. We hit the top 150 of Audible originals. It got rated really well, and it was my step from going from being a movie producer to being an author. And so I said, I want to do this and do a proof of concept. And because of that, how well it performed, and in short order, we had about collectively on our social media gaining about 50,000 followers around this concept and these characters. It was like, okay, now this has legs, and this is something that we're going to take to the next level. So that's the premise and how we got here.
Mm-hmm. With that in mind, there is a concept in TTRPG design and a lot of TTRPG worlds will have this in multiple forms that's colloquially known as Appendix N. This is a reference to the Appendix N section that was in very early editions of Dungeons & Dragons that had a list of inspirational media, whether it be books, television, film, comic books, music, and so on. So in the case of Flux Destiny, to better illustrate the feel that it's going for, what would be some of the items that would be in that Appendix N, also known as inspirational media in, say, the White Wolf games?
So you're saying like other media that
other media that served as inspiration, and in the case of the RPG, could be used to help get a better feel for what the tone is.
Yeah, so if you look at, like, for me, obviously I'm very inspired by anime, given that I've been, an anime executive for many years and a producer. I'm a huge fan of anime and video games, and when I look at big, sweeping, epic anime or anime adjacent, like Avatar: The Last Airbender, Full Metal Alchemist, My Hero Academia, Cowboy Bebop, Trigun, shows like this, and when you reference, video games like Final Fantasy, taking what I love about these particular properties is that they have these deep worlds and systems that work within them that allow for not only a main story, but like I was saying earlier, for other people to be able to tell their stories within them. So I loved, those are kind of areas that I drew inspiration from. And, it's it's had a big impact on me.
Hmm. So, obviously, when it comes to using anime as inspiration, that I've seen a lot of folks say that they want to make a anime inspired RPG or something like that, and something I've often had to correct them is you're treating anime as a genre. It's a medium, and a wide net at that. But it is quite telling that when it comes to the anime you've mentioned, some of them are going to lean far more into the shonen or shonen battle manga
Right.
subgenres.
That's right.
And I do think that's an important distinction to make because I grew up with a lot of early attempts at anime and TTRPG form, and a lot of them were very much downstream from universalist games like GURPS or Hero.
Hmm.
There's nothing wrong with that, but it's a case of trying to put everything in the kitchen sink into one book, and that has its own caveats.
Hmm. Hmm.
Universal Universalist games are sometimes romanticized by their followers as being able to do anything with them, which is technically true, but that is like I liken it to when imagine if your kid wanted a Disney princess doll and you give them a Princess Leia action figure. You're technically correct, but you kind of missed the point.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. That's right.
Uh, and it's one of those things that has to be addressed. And fortunately, as more people have gotten more exposed, you see less of that overall genre approach and more of trying to draw upon specifics. Uh,
Yeah, I could see that, and I see, I have seen exactly what you're talking about as well, where people confuse the genre and the medium, and that anime is a medium,
mhm.
but it has certain qualities that make it a genre, in so to speak, as well. When we were looking at Funimation, for example, taking certain IPs to create anime off them, or there were certain things that we had to certain things that people associate with anime, and I think that's what they're responding to, which is there's a certain creative bravery that comes out of the difference between Western style animation in particular and anime is not only the style, but it's also the way that the directors are treated, right? Like a director in an anime is very much like hiring Quentin Tarantino, right? Like you'd hire someone who's like they have a vision, or a Steven Spielberg. Like those are you hire those guys and they have a vision and they're going to do what they want. Look what Miyazaki did even with his own adaptations of other people's books. They have a vision, they go do it. Whereas in American animation, it's very different in Western style, where it's very much the director, of course, sets the vision, except but it doesn't have the same kind of auteur control that a anime director has.
Yeah.
And so because of that, you get much stronger visions from anime storytelling in terms of anime series. They're much more unique because someone had a vision and they execute on it. And I would argue that when you look at something like Avatar: The Last Airbender, the reason why it was so successful, amongst a list of reasons, but one of them was that it had a vision. It took the best qualities of what makes anime, which is carrying through that vision, and then they executed on it. And I'm sure they have, and I've watched interviews and read books. They had their own challenges, right? Making it network television. It's not making avatars way more difficult than making an anime in Japan for a number of reasons.
Oh yeah.
But anyways, I'm going off script. But you touch an area that I'm really passionate about, and I'm so glad you brought that up because
it is funny you bring up Avatar when it comes to that, because in reading some books and the like, I ended up learning that there were quite a few in jokes that they snuck in.
Yeah.
Like the character of Julie was them making fun of the Nickelodeon exec
Right.
representative.
Yeah.
Or in the Swordmaster episode, that ridiculous armor that Aang had put on was that was them taking the piss out of some of the ridiculous toy concepts that
Right.
that were submitted to them. A lot of them that got rejected because it was just drowning in gimmickry and just looked really, really stupid.
And I saw that sketch and especially the sketch. I think I saw it in one of those in the art book. It was like really insane. Like it was like anime crazy, you know?
Yeah, or the fact that the Cabbage Merchant was their own little tribute to the 3 old guys from Cowboy Bebop who keep showing up.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right.
And I've taken that even in my own projects and try and have some sort of running joke that is blink and you miss it. I think in one case because of the fact that all of my players were in Minnesota, there was always one scene where somebody slaps a mosquito. Every single sessions that you hear a loud slap of somebody slapping a mosquito, because being around the lakes, mosquitoes are a problem. They're called the unofficial state bird for a reason.
But why? But you bring that up, and what's so great about what you said is it's so funny how our whole conversation, I like the connections from everything prior to our conversation to now, is that the reason those kind of things are so fun and why people love those kind of things is because they're the inside joke, right? And it shows that you're a real fan of a universe when you know the running joke. To someone out of context, that wouldn't make sense, right? But someone who's lived it and knows it and takes the time to appreciate the universe and everything about it, even the little things like the mosquito joke in your situation, that makes you a true fan,
And now I am certainly no stranger to the concept of TTRPGs that are adapted from existing IPs. I've done a whole mini-series on ones like Star Wars. I am planning on doing one on Star Trek. It's just that because of recent updates, I have to delay that while I wait for a certain thing. And I've done one on Lord of the Rings. And one of the key things that I always try and get on people, and I'm guessing this has been brought up when it came to the idea of doing Flux Fantasy as a TTRPG, is making sure that it is just as approachable for people who are familiar with Flux Fantasy, i.e. they've either read the webcomic or the other media beforehand, as well as people for whom this is going to be their first introduction to that universe, because every RPG is someone's first. And is that something that you guys have taken into consideration when designing Flux Fantasy in its TTRPG form?
Oh man, you have no idea.
Yeah, go for it, Ella. I was gonna say, but you go ahead, because this was exactly the conversation when Ella first joined me. The conversation we had. Go ahead, Ella.
This RPG is sort of developing at the same time as the book, and so we get a lot of benefits from that because it's sort of an adaptation of a universe, but the books aren't written necessarily. The pilot book is written, but the real canon isn't there yet. And so one of our key goals is to make this game as approachable as possible, both within the lore and as a game itself, because that was something that was really important to us, is that we're a lore heavy universe, and there's a lot of different mechanics, so we wanted it to feel familiar but also make a lot of sense.
And when we did it, when we first started, it's so funny because it's like you said verbatim what I talked to Ella about when she first joined, was that I wanted it to be something that it could be your first RPG. I wanted to channel my own experiences, but I wanted it to be something that could be your first RPG that could also introduce you to the world of Flux Destiny. If you didn't know it, you didn't have to read the books to get into it, because the lore stands on its own. You don't have to know the mainline story to play it. It could be your first introduction into it, or it could be your first RPG, or it could be your first entrance into the Flux Destiny universe. And so creating something that was accessible in that way, that was fun and narratively focused, where it didn't feel like a a lot of like, I have to spend a lot of prep time to get into this, is one thing that we talked about. And so we wanted to create that, but at the same time wasn't elementary, where it's like, okay, this thing is so elementary, but to focus on the narrative part and to focus on the community aspect of getting friends together and making friends out of this experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've had a lot of people come to Flux Destiny through the RPG, through the, sort of beta version that we're just now getting into and just now launching. Like, we just put out a character sheet. People come into the world and they start to learn the lore sort of backwards almost than we thought that they would, and they come in through Flux Fantasy first. And so we wanted it to be an understandable world where you could get it pretty fast, but then if you wanted to dig deeper, there was so many layers. Like, you could just play casually, but if you wanted to know more, you could dig for days, and never reach the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Now, getting into that, this is where it's important to go into what I like to call the Rome effect. You've probably heard the expression "all roads lead to Rome" in some form or fashion.
Right.
What this refers to is that with a lot of RPGs, in fact, I'd say the vast majority of the ones that have come out in the last 30 or so years, there is the concept of having a core mechanic that everything else springs out from, as opposed to a bunch of separated subsystems, which is how a lot of the very early games handled things. So, what would be Flux Destiny's Rome? Is it a straight D20 aim high? Is it a D20 aim low? Are you dealing with a pool? How are you guys handling it?
Yeah, we run on a D20 system.
All right.
At least right now, because we're in the beta and it could definitely change. But right now we're running off of a D20 system. And yeah, it's we wanted it to be comfortable for people who had played before and had, seen other RPGs, and so it's a pretty we have other unique mechanics, but most of them run off of that D20 system.
Which certainly makes sense. Now, when it comes to that, this is another thing that I think is worth noting, and this is the big elephant in the room that's sitting on my couch, is the way karma ends up working. Now, you have a whole setup on the page about how karma works, that it is messing with reality, but if you do it too much, it can create a backlash. So I suppose the first part is, where did this idea of utilizing karma to bend reality in this manner, where did the inspiration come as a magic system?
So funny you asked this, because Ella and I were just recording a video for YouTube that I think comes out in a couple days, where she was asking me this exact question for it, because we're doing a series on this, just on the backstory of Flux Destiny. It's all inspired by, and I'm sure just from your own experiences, from all of us who are creators or just human beings in general, you go to school, you're told that, you go to school and that, you study, you go to college, and that you're going to, accomplish your dreams, just work hard and whatever. Well, we know that life is, once you get out of school, you start realizing that, life is not that easy. It doesn't work that way. It's not a linear path, right? Things are a real curvy path to get, to where you want to go. But in that process, we all as human beings go through things, that's not fair. I did this and it didn't work out the way I thought it was going to be, or that person cheated and they got what they wanted, right? And they but they didn't do it sincerely like I did, right? Like those themes that as young people we all experience and go through and have to experience about the reality of what the world is like. And during that process, I started to, especially in the entertainment industry, which, starting in my early 20s in that space was it's a daunting experience, because you go in thinking it's all magical and whatever, and you realize it's quite the opposite. Mm-hmm. So I channeled that experience into, over the next several years, of like, okay, how can I take my this experience I've had about life and how my feelings about it, and how can I turn it into a basis for a magic system. And the the concept of karma came out. Well, how can we make karma something literal? And I toiled with this for some time, creating a magic system where something is driven by karma, and what does that mean, and how do we make it unique, and how do we put strings attached to that? And so I spent the next several years developing what ended up becoming karmistry, which is the manipulation of karma the channeling of karma to manipulate the universe to basically achieve all sorts of superhuman feats. But the strings attached is payback, right? There is an exponential curve of payback that occurs when you do this. And so it's like taking that.
Oh, there he is.
Oh, yep. Sorry about that. Discord decided to derp on me.
Oh no, it's no problem. It's no problem. So taking that to create the basis for the magic system that was the inspiration for it. And then of course we carried it over into the mechanics of Flux Fantasy. But that's the origin of it.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, you do have it's not like it's magic in the traditional sense, and I'm actually glad for that, because there are some magic systems that I feel have overstayed their welcome or need a re-examination. The big one is that whole spells per day thing that Dungeons and Dragons has insisted on for the longest time. Even when I started back in advanced second, when I was a little kid, I never was fond of it. The whole spells per day thing, because there isn't really a narrative justification for it. Especially when magic is everywhere and you're trying to act like it's a very limited affair, as opposed to something like MP, which that's going to make sense, or even with this, where where you have essentially magic as a game of chicken.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right. That's right. Or that's a great way to put it. Yeah,
I suppose a game of chicken, or a game of any card game you'd find at a casino.
Right.
And the reason I say a game of chicken with this is, in any game of chicken, whether it be the driving that you see in so many teen movies in the 50s, or something like that, there's always the option to back off.
Yes,
there's always the option to back away from the table and call it a night. But there's always that little shoulder devil saying, just push it a little bit further and see what happens. Because risk reward is one of the most effective uses of mechanics in TTRPGs, because you are putting that pressure on the players to try and push that luck.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, with that in mind, as I understand it, even though you have a power system with how karma can be utilized, this isn't exactly freeform, and that's where karma specialties and karma studies come in.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And if I can say something, I'm going to let Ella explain the mechanics, but I just want to say real quick that that just to comment on something you said earlier about the magic systems in general, for a lack of a better term, we call it a magic system, but we wanted to create something that was not, if you wanted to put it between a soft and a hard magic system, it's kind of like leans definitely more hard, because we wanted it to be something that had restrictions and that could create the best stories are ones where you're overcoming challenges and tricky problems, right? That you can't just magic your way out of, right? And if you have magic, you have to be able to use it in a way that could possibly, if you use it, could possibly make the situation worse, right? So that was very important to me, was to make something that was more of a science and an art, which is something I loved about, like, if you remember in Avatar: Last Airbender, I think the first episode where Sokka calls it magic, and she tells him it's not magic. Katara responds and says it's not magic, it's bending, you know, and it grounds it, right? It grounds it into this is not going to be something hand wavy, you know. And so that was very important for me when I was creating Karmistry for that. And then now just porting over to Ella to let her talk about how that translated into this.
I do want to interject. I do want to interject with one observation, and this is something I see. It's a common trap, and it's one that, from my observation, you guys have avoided. There's a lot of times when I've seen people try and make a anime-inspired TTRPG, they still fall into the bad habit of having a separating line between the martial and the magic. But if you look at an innumerable amount of anime from different genres, whether it be a lot of shonen fighting manga, whether it be some seinen, any variety that are using some sort of supernatural ability as a core part of their world, that barrier doesn't really exist. A lot of characters are what would be known in the trade as a gish. Gish, if you're not familiar, is a shorthand for characters that are just as proficient in combat with weapons or unarmed as they are with spellcasting. Whether that spellcasting is actual spells or psychic effects, that's not important to the term. And well, let's consider, we brought up FMA, so let's look at Edward Elric in that sense. He doesn't really fit the role of a traditional martial-based character or a traditional spellcaster in that world. And you brought up Avatar earlier, and the same, I'd say it applies even more so given the relationship with bending and martial arts styles. And from what I'm seeing, because of the way karma works, that particular separating line I've mentioned that's in more traditional games doesn't really apply here. Everybody has that hybrid kind of approach.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, karma is extremely difficult. You know, it's something that's really, it's strenuous. It's something that's difficult to do. It takes a lot of skill to do it. And although it's everywhere, not everybody can just like pick it up and do it.
And that's why we wanted to also avoid, Mildred, like we wanted to avoid a situation where people were special, like that you're special, like only special people could do it. It's like that's not the case in this universe. Anyone can perform Karmistry, but it's kind of like, it's
kind of like a cultivation story in that sense.
Well, it's like some people are more like, for example, you don't want me to be a brain surgeon. I'm not going to go and I wouldn't make a horrible neurosurgeon. Okay. But it doesn't mean I wouldn't be capable of learning it and doing it, but that's just not what my skills lead to. Right. Yeah. And so that's the same in this universe, is that you can have anyone, it can do it, but so no one is special by, you're not going to have a hero story where they wake up and, oh, this person is the one in our city who can perform Karmistry and no one else can't because something special. That doesn't occur because it's more about the your desire to do it, to learn to go through the hard steps of learning how to perform Karmistry and committing to that, and then facing the risks to play that game of chicken that you were talking about earlier. So that's kind of how we see it.
And the thing that I'm very much reminded of is my time studying things like cultivation novels or wuxia and tianxia. And I'm well aware of my bad Chinese, but I'm not going to learn several languages just to make a point.
It's okay. No judgment here.
Yeah, and because of the fact that if you look in a lot of those stories, the idea that only certain individuals are able to utilize those techniques is not the case. Anyone feasibly can in theory, but in practice, it does take a certain mindset to actually go through with the rigors of doing it.
Hmm.
Oh, which oddly enough, that was the early intent in something like Star Wars of it being a higher understanding that anybody can study. That ended up getting undermined with the whole midichlorian thing, and
Right.
I've always been critical of that introduction because it does kind of bottleneck things.
Right.
Uh, but even with that, getting into the karma studies, um, the it does it would it be fair of me to say that in a roundabout way, not in a linear fashion, but karma studies and karma specialties would be would be somewhat analogous to class and specialization.
Oh yeah. Yes. That's a very good observation, and I think that it would be very fair to say that.
Hmm. Since as I understand it, each all of them are using karma in some form.
Yes,
It's just
exactly.
it's just that each of them had the ways that they can use it is going to differ between the main four, and those main four, of course, are escape artist, ink fighter, special agent, and clockbot. Um,
Yes,
I'd
exactly.
I'd kind of like to get into the overall playstyle of those four studies, those four main pillars, you could say, of karma use.
Yeah, so they each use karma a little bit differently. They have different intentions, really. We wanted our RPG to kind of be more about the character's life path, how they choose to use karmistry depends on kind of what study they go into. Doing escape artist study is extremely difficult and takes a lot of time, and it's probably arguably the most powerful way to use karmistry.
Hmm.
But it also incurs the most payback, which is sort of like the danger of using karma in any form. So that sort of escape artists, they use it in a way where they just have sort of these specialties, with they could be creative, they could be a machine escape artist, and they have these different areas of study, but they're arguably the most powerful. Ink fighters, on the other hand, are sort of they're not lazy necessarily, but they take the shortcut when it comes to karmistry, where they fuse karma basically into these what we're calling sigils, which are kind of like tattoos,
Hmm.
and they can use them in like big blasts, like where their ink sort of comes off their body and comes to life. But there's not a lot of risk involved necessarily. There's risk in making the tattoos, but not really risk after that. But they're not as powerful. And it's sort of just like a quick and dirty way to learn karmistry if you don't want to go to school for 20 years, and learn all of the special math that's involved and that sort of stuff.
Hmm.
Um, the special agents of our world are sort of like secret agents. They can be from any agency, and they're sort of like they use karma tech. So in our world, karma is basically everywhere, and karmistry is basically used by everybody, but everybody uses it a little bit differently. It's so like ingrained in the world that even like light fixtures are used. Karmistry is kind of like electricity in some ways, and our karma agents, um one of their main jobs is to sort of regulate that, and so they use karma tech to enhance their own abilities of like running and jumping and that sort of stuff. They also have karma disruptors, which like stop other people from using karma. And then the last group is sort of an interesting group. There are clock bots, which clock bots are run sort of off of karma, because they're robots. They're these sort of hybrid creatures that have been built by people, but they have a little bit more function in their brain than a normal just robot would, because they're sort of imbued with this power. And some of them can even use karmistry. So some of them use tech, kind of like the special agents, and some of them can actually kind of use like lower forms of chemistry, but they've got they're a little bit more armored, against that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's how everybody uses it a little bit differently, and there's just different risks involved. Using a tech as a special agent isn't gonna bring back as much danger on you as say an escape artist. So it's sort of it all evens out with the way that you're trying to play.
Hmm. Now, when it comes to powers, because that can take a lot of different forms. When it comes, do you do you plan on providing a few example powers within further updates to kind of illustrate the potential that that each form of chemistry can manifest?
Yeah. We right now in our character creation guide, we've got some like basic inspirational powers. But it's really actually funny that you say that. We just finished the escape artist power videos where we kind of go into depth, and Chris did a really good job on it, and he went in and kind of gave more ideas about what you could do because there is a lot that you can do with it. So yes, we hope to have a pretty big list of inspired things that you can do with each group because it is kind of nuanced. Each person can do different things and they're a little bit different from each other.
Yeah. Something something that I may suggest, and maybe this is something you guys have considered, especially with the talk of building one's OC with the system that you guys are developing. There's a handful of videos out there, and even I've contributed to this in some form, of taking characters from various anime and how one might stat out their particular skill set in a given TTRPG.
Yeah.
I've done that plenty of times. Michael Serbrook, who currently works on Prowlers and Paragons, a superhero RPG, did that a lot with adapting all manner of characters from anime, from film, from television, and whatnot into the hero system.
Yeah.
Is that something you guys have considered for down the road of using that to showcase what can be done with the system you guys have?
Yeah, that's a great idea. It's something that we wanted to do. We've obviously just been making our own characters in there right now because they have crazy powers. But yeah, like we want to add anime characters in there. We want to even do like fairy tale characters because we really want to showcase sort of the range that is available.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because this is something that was my intent from the when I was developing Karmistry itself was that when I was trying to determine, well, what is going to make this particular system unique, and what I realized was that Karmistry, what I ended up developing with Karmistry is that you can basically do Karmistry is very much like how Neo in the Matrix can like mess with the programming of the Matrix and do things.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that, but in the real world, right? So you use Karmistry to affect the way the real world works. So you can change, physical properties of the world. You can change the weather. You can change certain things about your physiology. You can do all sorts of things that are really. You could go down a list of superpowers of like you could go down this superpower encyclopedia, and you could do all of those things thanks to Karmistry with the catch that payback is associated with it, right? You have to manage the payback that's associated. Mm-hmm. So what you're suggesting is it's something, yeah, that Elle and I had talked about before, but I'm so glad you said that because it's a great way to demonstrate the flexibility of the system and how you can take these different characters from different universes and plug them in and see their stats play out.
Yeah. As an aside, I will note that I appreciate the presence of the Medkit Plus part of the core mechanics, since I mean, yeah, I could say that it's not too far removed from hit dice in D&D 5th edition or healing surges in 4th, the edition that I'm supposed to hate, but I don't because I don't get paid. But what I see in that is providing players, regardless of their setup, some means of healing in combat. instead of having one particular character be designated as the heal bot, which
Right.
was a problem
Yeah.
in some games back in the day, and is somewhat of a problem in some video game RPGs, but they're but because of the fact that you're dealing with single player, or you're dealing with MMOs where it's built around that, it's not as much of a problem. And hell, even
Yeah.
healers in most MMOs these days have something they can do besides healing.
Yeah, exactly. And there's going to be groups that are lean more towards that, but that comes later. A lot of our basic stats, you know, don't revolve around specific things like that because we wanted everybody to be able to be really creative. We didn't want them to be stuck in a niche in one way or another.
And I really have to give Ella a lot of credit for that because she, helped balance that out and introduce some of those. The med kit is all her, and being able to. One of the things when I first concepted it, and then Ella came on, was to find a way to make it where we have these characters who, like, for example, she mentioned escape artists are potentially very powerful characters, right? But why you would want to play other classes, right, of people in this world. And that credit is on her for helping balance that out so that there are pros and cons for playing the different ones, and also providing these kind of mechanisms like med kits, et cetera, so that someone is not just the healer, right? That you have to, because no one is one dimensional in real life either. Mm-hmm. We wanted people to be fully fleshed out characters. And I got to give her a huge credit for that because he helped make that more apparent in this version.
Yeah, and on the other end of things, because of the fact that things such as payback phantoms are mentioned as a motif. I get motif's not the best word, but a form that payback can take. This does bring me to the question of designing adversaries. So
Yeah.
I'll just rip the band-aid off. Do you guys plan on putting in a full adversary creation system within Flux Destiny?
Yes. We're gonna have lots of things that we give both examples for, but we also allow the GM to completely make based off of the type of sort of punishment, I guess is the best word for it, that they want to give the player for, sort of abusing their powers. So we give lots of different examples, in the game where we're going to have lots of just stats that you could use. Like if you needed to just roll for something and throw an enemy in there, you can grab from the enemy pack. But we're also having lots of moments in which the GM is fully capable of making their own characters. If somebody does something, for example, that's like they tear up the earth, and they destroy a town. Well, the payback or the monster that might come from that might be this giant earth monster because, it sort of goes into this theme of what goes around comes around, and that's a big theme for us. And so we wanted the GMs to be just as creative as the players, with the way that they produce their creatures, and the way that they play their characters should be just as creative.
Mm-hmm. And I can certainly see that. There's sometimes a issue that can crop up with games that just use a bestiary, in the sense that no matter how many monsters you put in it, you can only put in so many, and depending on the type of campaign, some of the about a third of the monsters you have in that might not even see the light of day. So
Right,
having I've advocated for the longest time that more games need to have a monster creation system, but getting to now, when it comes to the setting, the alternate Earth that you essentially have within this, within future updates, do you plan on putting, say, primers for, at the very least, Fortuna and some of the cities within Fortuna?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Fortuna is completely mapped out. So I spent quite some time building out the country itself, and there's an official map for it, and cities and lore behind the whole country and everything. So it's very, very thought out, not only for the RPG, but obviously for the book series. It was I spent years developing the lore behind the country itself. But on top of that, the rest of the globe has been developed. So we have an entire world of different countries that some are karmic powers, right? They use karmistry in different ways, and you can originate from different countries in the world. In this version of Flux Fantasy, it's focused right now solely on Fortuna for the test. But as we roll out our updates, we're going to expand out and provide opportunities for people to create create characters from different countries in the world with all their own unique cultures and way they use karmistry, etc. So, and it's very much like like I said, it's an alternate Earth. So you'll find a lot of similar cultures in this universe.
Mm-hmm. And with now, with my next question, I do want to ask: are either of you familiar with Shadowrun?
No, I'm not.
No.
Now,
Did you say Shadowrun? What did you say? I didn't hear.
Shadowrun.
No, I'm not.
Now, the reason I bring that up is not for its setting or anything like that, because it's a completely different ball game, but to use it as an example of a place that within its core book has a certain area built in as a kind of starting point. Not starting point in terms of an MMO, but something that a GM could potentially build around. In that case, It is its version of Seattle. Within what you guys have planned for the Flux Fantasy TTRPG, do you plan on using a certain city as a starting point, a kind of template that newbie GMs could build around?
Yes. Yeah. Chris will talk better about this than I would, but our capital city is called Andromeda, and it's all Fortuna is very like star based, and it's all themed sort of around that. Chris, you want to talk about Andromeda a little bit?
Yeah. So Andromeda. So in our alternate United States, which is basically Fortuna, Andromeda is the capital and biggest city, and it's also the hotbed of karmistry. This is where everyone comes to go, to learn it, to practice it. The great escape artists, which are like the greatest of all of them, they're like movie stars. They're like famous sports athletes. That's the kind of level of fame they have. So Andromeda is very much like an alternate Los Angeles, right? And so it's the basis for all of this. It's the basis of like the biggest karmistry academies are there. So it's a natural, starting point for it.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, do you guys plan on putting out a quick start of say just the basic rules, a few pre-gens, and a sample adventure sometime in the future?
Yeah, that's actually really funny that you say that, because our guidebook will actually come with what we're calling a tutorial game right now. It'll basically be like sort of a game where you can test your powers and go into it, and sort of like a session zero for both GMs and for players, and it will come with the guidebook. It will be a part of it because we think it's really important to allow people to explore sort of the basics of it without having to start a campaign that you're really invested in and you don't quite know how to play. And it's very it's not super like lore heavy or necessarily narrative driven, but it's just a place where you can kind of go around and test everything that you want to test before jumping into the game.
Mm-hmm. Which is ultimately vital, because when you're dealing with a concept like this, having something that the players can build around is very important. Now, with that said, I do want to sincerely thank both of you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple and enjoying the madness that happens around here. And anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged.
Well, I'll tell you, Mildred, we just really appreciate you bringing us on. We, when knowing the level of depth that you go into, questions about, the journalism you do around these kind of things, we're really honored that you brought us on, and and that you were interested in what we were doing, and we just appreciate the time to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. And of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there will be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.